Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for Friday Focus. For those of you that are not familiar with this format, Friday Focus is an online talk series that is hosted by the Hunterian, and we are the Museum and Art Gallery at the University of Glasgow. In each edition of these talks, we'll hear from a different speaker and we'll cover a different topic of interest. We tend to look at our exhibitions and displays that are happening across our venues, as well as research that goes on at the Hunterian and the University of Glasgow and beyond, and all the exciting work that happens behind the scenes with our collections. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Tim Wright, who is a numismatic author. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the term numismatics, but that is the collection and study of coins. And Tim is going to talk to us today about the history and significance of Dr. William Hunter's Naxos coin, which is held in the Hunterian collections. So before I hand over to Tim for the presentation today, I just wanted to let you all know that there's going to be some time at the end for any questions that you might have. And you can pop your questions in the chat as we go through by clicking on the speech bubble at the very bottom of your screen. And I will read those out for you at the end. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us online today. And I will hand over to Tim now to deliver this week's talk.
Thank you, Eleni. Hello, everybody. First of all, apologies for the slightly melodramatic title, masterpiece or fake. But in my defense, both terms have been used to describe the particular ancient Greek coin held in the Hunterian collection. Both terms carry a lot of baggage. I think we should acknowledge that. We are increasingly concerned about authenticity in the current environment, and I think increasingly suspicious about the use of the word fake. And masterpiece, again, carries quite a lot of baggage with its connotations of elite views about Western art, and not least its masculine connotations. But let's put that to one side, as the coin in question has been described and considered a numismatic masterpiece. In fact, every time one comes up for auction, the catalogue will describe it as such. Secondly, a number of eminent numismatists have questioned the authenticity of the example of this coin that is held in the Hunterian. So I think if we just move on to provide a, oops, I'm just trying to, okay. If we move on just to provide an overview for everybody. Naxos, when you say Naxos, people think of the island in the Aegean. Actually, Naxos was the first Greek city established in Sicily in the 8th century BC. And it was founded by a number of Greeks, including some from the island of Naxos, which is where it got its name from. It's located in the northeast of Sicily, and would be about the first landfall that you would come to if you were sailing from Greece around the boot of Italy. It also has the distinction of being one of the first Greek cities in Sicily to be destroyed. It was destroyed and abandoned at the end of the 5th century BCE. And in between, it experienced some trials and tribulations, but it also produced some extraordinary coins, including the Naxos tetradrachm, which is the focus of this study. It's estimated that 20,000 or up to 20,000 of these coins would have been produced back in the 5th century BCE, of which we estimate that around 78 have survived, including 30 or so in museums. The Hunterian has 2 of those. So across only 30 around the world, 2 are in the Hunterian. One was donated in the 19th century by Thomas Coates, the industrialist. We're not going to talk about that one. And one was part of the original bequest from Dr. William Hunter in the 18th century. And that's going to be the focus of this discussion. 2 eminent numismatists, George MacDonald, who wrote the catalogue of the Hunter collection at the end of the 19th century, and Herbert Kahn, who wrote the definitive study on the coins of Naxos, Sicily in 1944, have questioned the authenticity of the hunter example. And in my recent research, I have revisited that debate and will share some of the findings with you. Before we jump into that debate, just a little bit of context on Greek coinage. The Greeks were not the first to invent coins. That goes to the Lydians in what is now modern-day Turkey. But the Greeks certainly popularized it and made it an integral part of their society and their culture. Their manufacture process was through hammering of coins, and that process is described on the left-hand side of this chart. It's pretty simple. You have a blank silver piece that is put in between two dies that have engraved mirror images of the impression you want on the coin, and then you hammer one on top of the other to produce the coin, as you'll see with some spectacular results. Numismatists like to call the heads of the coin the obverse, but we can call it heads, and they call the tails of the reverse. In terms of denominations, just to put the tetradrachm that we're going to be looking at in context, there are lots of different denominations across the Greek world, and Greek cities often had their own denominations of different weights and definitions, and this worked for internal purposes, but not for interstate trade. So increasingly, the Athenian standard or the Attic standard was adopted, and that's what's on the right-hand side. That's a system that is anchored in two coins, the obol and the drachm. The obol is a small coin. It's about 0.7 of a gram. And it would have been used for everyday transactions in the market to buy fruit and veg and those sorts of things. 6 obols make a drachm or drachma. It will look much more familiar to you. So that's about 4.3 grams. And that was a much more serious amount of money. That would be the equivalent of the daily wage of a skilled worker or a soldier. Our denomination is a tetradrachm, which, as its name suggests, is 4 drachms, and that's about 17 or 17.2, 17.3 grams of silver. So why is the Naxos tetradrachm considered a masterpiece? I'm going to explore this through 5 lenses of art, history, provenance, economics, and crime. The most obvious lens is that of art. What you see in front of you is it's not the hunter coin, it's another example in better condition, has to be said. And just to give you a sense of scale, on your screen, this is about 5 times the size of the actual coin. So the first thing that's striking is how much artistry and detail, exquisite detail, is provided in such a small coin. But this is not why the coin is considered a masterpiece. It's considered such because it was an important change in style. It was innovative in terms of composition, and it was at a level of execution that was only seen perhaps half a century later. So it was groundbreaking. The style is considered a transition between the Greek archaic and the Greek classical style. And we'll see that more on the obverse. So the obverse, or the heads, depicts Dionysus, the god of wine. This is not a portrayal that we would expect. This is not the fun-loving god that we've known to Bacchus, that we've come to know and love. But this is a rather severe portrait, constrained, with very much under control, with a hairdo, a top knot, a chignon, a groomed beard, a very serious expression. But there's something else happening. The engraver has taken the frame, and the beaded border is the coin equivalent of a frame, and he has the image bursting through that frame in about 4 places. And that means that this constrained image or austere image also has great vitality and strength to it. The reverse, or the tails, is a very different image. It is of Silenus, who is the companion of Dionysus, a satyr, half man, half goat or horse with a tail, and he's depicted nude, brazen, drinking from a cup of wine. Apart from an interesting subject, an exquisite finishing, the composition here is really quite creative and innovative. We have Silenus crouching in a precarious position. He's crouching, he looks relaxed, yet he's poised, and he's leaning and drinking, about to drink from a cup. The engraver has achieved two things here. First is balance. There will be a risk with the right-facing head and cup of imbalance, but that's offset by his left leg and thigh, which are pointing out to the left. And then secondly, a sense of perspective is created by the knee, the right leg and the shin and the knee, which is coming out to the viewer and has the rest of the image behind it. This is one of the few and certainly the earliest examples of perspective in a coin. So there's a lot going on in this coin. Certainly there were other fantastic coins produced by the Sicilian Greeks, but the most famous ones of equivalent quality, innovation, and standard are about 50 years later. So this was groundbreaking. This is why it's considered a masterpiece. But we are looking at this in isolation. We're trying to judge it by our own standards, and we need to get inside the heads a little bit of the people who produced it. So the next thing we'll look at is the history. The next lens we'll use is the history. And history here, we have two sources. On the one hand, we have the classical sources, which tend to be given a sort of gospel status, even though some of them were written 500 years after the events, and the archaeological evidence. The classical sources portray Naxos as a follower, as a victim, not really that important, even though it was the first to be founded, even though it was famously exiled and returned from exile and maybe produced this coin during that time. But the archaeological evidence challenges this little Naxos view. It's a substantial site. There are naval dockyards. There was a medium-sized navy, and there's evidence that it was also a religious center from which people going to the Greek mainland, Greeks from Sicily going to the Greek mainland, would make sacrifices en route out. And so it had a much greater status. So in addition to having a great historical backstory, it has a status that in some ways equates to the status of the coin that it produced. The next lens we use for looking at this masterpiece is that of provenance. And what this chart does is it tries to track the individual coins where we know about the history of ownership, and say, track the journey through time and space. So all these coins started in Sicily. They were mainly discovered in the 19th century, some earlier, and they have traveled through different public and private collections and auctions over time. In terms of the masterpiece question, this is a coin that was a must-have for the great collections, both public and private, and also being part of those collections enhanced its status. The next lens is economics. Not surprisingly, given what I've described, the market believes that this is a masterpiece. If you look at sales of ancient Greek coins over the last 25 years and rank them in terms of the hammer or the price achieved, this coin is close to the top, number 2. Today, a coin of this type in good condition with reasonable provenance would cost about £500,000, dollars, or euros. It's a substantial price to pay for 17 grams of silver. So the market certainly thinks it is a masterpiece. We don't know what Dr. Hunter paid for his example. The first recorded sale of a Naxos coin was in 1824 for £5. And so between then and now, that represents 100,000 times increase. Of course, part of that is inflation. So if we adjust for inflation, it's 1,000 times increase. And so we've had real asset appreciation, even in excess of other assets like houses, stock market prices, or even the art index or other coins. So this is a coin that the market ranks highly and increasingly so. Because of that, it has also been a focus for crime. And it may seem perverse to say part of the reason why it's a masterpiece is because it's been the subject of crime, but criminals certainly have increasingly thought it was worth either forging, looting, trafficking, or selling with false provenance. And all of those things have happened with respect to this coin. The figures on the left-hand side, these are examples of forged Naxos coins. Some of them are pretty impressive, pretty good coins. Others where the dies have been recut. The chap in the middle is Giacomo Medici, nothing to do with the Renaissance Medici family. He was convicted as the leader of the network of looters and traffickers of antiquities, including ancient coins like the Naxos coins. And finally, on the right-hand side, as recently as 2020, an Naxos coin was sold with falsified provenance, and the person responsible for that was arrested in New York and admitted falsifying the provenance of a trafficked Naxos coin. So that's on the masterpiece question. If we move on to the example in the Hunter collection, I don't need to tell you about William Hunter. I'm sure you're very familiar with him. He was a shining example of the Scottish Enlightenment movement. He was a physician, an obstetrician, a scientist, and also a great collector. He obviously had origins in Scotland, was at the University of Glasgow, but then lived and practiced most of his life in London. As a collector, he collected manuscripts, books, and coins, and he was a pretty serious collector, having collected about 30,000 coins, including 12,000 ancient Greek ones. Most of these were collected towards the end of the 18th century, and it is said that he bought just about everything that was going, which would have been collections of others, as well as hoards. Importantly, for what we're going to consider on authenticity, he was also focused on quality as well as quantity, and he consulted with other great collectors who are contemporaries, like the Reverend Tracherode, who was a trustee of the British Museum and donated his Naxos tetradrachm to the British Museum, which is now on display there. He would upgrade his collection, he would sell duplicates, he would improve the quality, he would spot fakes. So he was a very serious collector. The Naxos coin, we don't know exactly when it was purchased. We have the evidence of the coin itself, which I'll talk about in a moment. There was a die break that emerged in these coins as they were produced. There's no evidence of that. So if it is genuine, it would have been an early example. And there is a possibility that it was acquired from Matthew Duane. Matthew Duane was a contemporary collector of Hunter. He was a Catholic conveyancing lawyer, and his example of the Naxos tetradrachm was used for an illustration in a book by a famous Sicilian numismatist. So we know he had one, and we know that Hunter acquired the Duane collection. So it may have been that. As I said, there are 78 known examples. The challenge here to the example in the Hunter collection has come from two sources. George MacDonald in 1899 wrote the catalogue documenting the Greek coin collection of Hunter. And in the entry on this particular coin, he said that the genuineness of the specimen is doubtful. It's about 30 grains too light. That's about 1.7 grams. And the design in the reverse has been finished with tooling. Below, you see some highlighted examples of possible evidence of casting, air bubbles, blurring, granular surfaces and the like. Less than 50 years later, Herbert Kahn wrote his book on the Naxos series in German, and he described this example as Guss falsum after the example number 25 in his listing. He excluded it from the 56 examples that he had identified at that time, but he thought it was a cast made from another coin. And you see below, we have done a computer analysis to look at the similarities between the coin in the Hunter collection and the one that Kahn thought it was cast from. So what is our conclusion with respect to the Hunter example and its authenticity? So against are a number of factors. The first one, and probably most striking, is the weight. This would be the lightest example of the Naxos tetradrachm that I have come across, substantially below the average. But there could be reasons for that, including wear. The condition is extremely poor, and as we saw previously, there are quite a few examples of the sort of red flags you see from casting. It's an unusual shape in that it's very round. It's almost too round, too perfect. The hammering process tends to distribute the silver blank in unpredictable directions, and so you don't tend to get perfectly round coins as a result. The die-axis is the relationship between where the heads and tail dies are struck, and that seems a little bit different from most of the other examples. And then having had the privilege of examining this coin in hand, it certainly feels a lot less chunky than the other examples that I've been able to examine. Normally, these coins feel very much like three-dimensional objects, almost more a pebble than a coin, whereas actually the Hunter example is quite flat. Against or for the authenticity of the Hunter example are a number of factors. The first one is that it's hard to find the specific evidence of the tooling that MacDonald identified on the reverse. And tooling, you have to be very careful. There would be tooling sometimes done to the dies in ancient times, halfway through the production process. There might have been tooling done to the finished coin in ancient times also. And then when they are found and rediscovered, the coins get cleaned up. And sometimes if there are apparent imperfections, they would be adjusted or tooled or improved by unscrupulous dealers. So tooling per se is not proof of a forgery or a fake. And apart from maybe anatomical details, I couldn't find evidence on the reverse. The comparison, Kahn's view that this coin is a cast based on another coin that he had identified, has a number of problems. The first problem is chronological, which is that the coin that he identifies can only be traced back to the late 19th century, whereas the Hunter coin, which supposedly was cast on the basis of that coin, originates in the late 18th century, about 120 years before. Secondly, we used computer imaging to compare the two images, and you would expect there to be quite a high correlation because these are coins struck from the same die. But if they were identical examples, you get a correlation of more than 95%. We got a correlation of 80%. Any Naxos tetradrachms would have a correlation of 70. So there wasn't conclusive evidence that this coin was a cast of another coin that Kahn identified. For me, perhaps the most compelling evidence of all is the fact that this coin has a provenance of 250 years. It's extraordinary. It is one of the oldest provenances of any Naxos tetradrachms that we have found. This was before the major discovery of this type in 1852, when over 30 examples were found in one hoard. And it was only really after that time that it became a famous coin and forgers bothered to copy it. And also the techniques in casting only really improved to the point of creating credible copies in the late 19th century. So just the provenance raises serious question marks as to whether this is a fake coin. The other, of course, is Hunter himself. He knew what he was doing. He was well connected with other people who knew what they were doing, and he had taste for the best examples available. There would not have been many examples of this coin available at the time, so that limited his choice. But we know that Cratchirode had an example, and if Cratchirode compared his example with Hunter's, then they would have had suspicions about it. And finally, we've run similar analysis on other Naxos tetradrachms, others among the 78, and found that actually very few were perfectly squeaky clean, and quite a few had red flags or evidence of casting or abnormalities. 12 had at least one red flag. 6 examples had multiple red flags. It has to be said the Hunter had more red flags than everyone else. So what do we conclude? Well, I will leave it up to you to reach your own conclusions. But on the 2 questions we started with, why or is this a numismatic masterpiece, and why is it a numismatic masterpiece? That's ultimately a question of judgment. But the evidence from the art, from the history, from the provenance, from the economics, and from the crimes that have been committed would suggest that it's a very good candidate. And my view is reflected in the title of my book, Travels with the Naxos Masterpiece. On the question of the authenticity of the Hunter example, so the masterpiece question was about the type. This is about the Hunter example. It certainly felt like a fake, but it has to be said that the weight of evidence is such that it's unproven. And for that reason, I included it in the 78 known examples of the Naxos tetradrachm. You will, of course, come to your own conclusions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. That was a real whistle-stop tour through what I can imagine has been a lot of research over a long time. If anybody's got any questions for Tim, you can pop them in the chat and I will read those out for you. I just had a few questions. I know we just touched on it a little bit there around Hunter's knowledge in the subject, but I wondered if while researching, if there was any evidence that you found around him questioning the authenticity himself, or was that not something that you believe he would have done at the time?
I would love to have found a smoking gun. And unfortunately, I didn't find one. So it's speculation. And the curators and staff of the Hunterian were very generous with their time. And when you get a coin out of the vaults and examine it, sometimes you find little notes or a cardboard disc that has some details of where it was bought and how much it was paid for and notes about it. Unfortunately, we have no contemporary evidence. That the first documented commentary about the authenticity is the George MacDonald 1899. I would love, I have a theory that Hunter bought the coin from Duane. I like that theory because the first published engraving of the coin around in the late 18th century was by an Italian numismatist, a Sicilian numismatist, and he used the Dwayne example. So I just love the idea that it was the Dwayne example that was bought, but I don't have a smoking gun to say, a correspondence that said, "Thank you for letting me buy your example."
Thank you. And just because we're looking at the cover of your book right now, I wondered if you could maybe just let us know where people could find more information, if they could find your book. Do you have a website?
Yeah. So thank you for that, and apologies for the shameless plug. So the book will be out very shortly, and it is published by Spink. Spink is an auction house of collectibles, but they're also a publishing house, and they publish books about coins for several centuries. So it will be available through Spink and ultimately through Amazon in the coming days or weeks.
Brilliant. And just before we joined the call, we were chatting together just about your interest in numismatics and it being a hobby. But I just wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about how that developed and where that hobby began for you.
Okay, sure. I think it's a relatively recent thing, as I've had a little bit more time to spend. I've always been slightly fascinated by ancient coins, and I guess for some maybe obvious reasons, but I'll share the reasons. The first is I just love the artistry of the coins. I mean, they are just beautiful objects. Whether they're masterpieces or not can be debated. Secondly, I love getting into the history and the story, the historical backstory of them. There is usually a story to tell, either who issued it, or when they issued it, or what was going on at the time, or what's the significance of what they put on the coin. I also, in a very basic way, you hold an ancient coin in your hand, and you imagine that others before you have done the same thing. And so I think of these coins as having had lives. They've had lives of 2,500 years. The first life was when they were produced, when they were used, and usually before they were buried. The reason we have them now and they've survived is because they were buried. And at that time, they were used to buy and sell things, not in the marketplace. This was too valuable a coin to buy your groceries. This would have paid for almost a week's work of someone. And the second life is from when they're discovered, and they're usually found in hoards and dug out of the ground. And then they go through the hands of collectors. And I find that fascinating as well. Who has owned the coin? Why did they collect? How were they able to collect? How did they have the means to collect? And what did they do with their collection? Did they give it to someone in their family? Did they sell it? Or did they give it to a museum? I find that fascinating as well. So for all of those reasons, over the last 5 or 10 years, I've become increasingly obsessed with ancient coins.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think that's just about all that we've got time for today. Thank you everyone for joining us online as well. A recording of this talk will be made available on our YouTube channel shortly, hopefully by next week. And good luck with the book, Tim. I'm sure you're looking forward to all the conversations that this will open up when it reaches people's bookshelves. Thanks again for today. And I hope everyone has a lovely weekend when it comes to it. Bye now.
Thank you, Eleni. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.